We got a lot to get into today, so I think we're just going to jump in. We're going to be doing two live automation setups, one using a tool called Relay, the other one using an email platform called Beehiiv. The goal here, just to recap, last week we talked about the value of creating templates as a way to generate leads, especially if they're focused resources for your target audience. So here we're continuing off of that and looking at the benefits of building up that email list from templates versus a standard subscribe form. And I think getting more tactical with how we can set up these automations. A lot of the same things that we're talking about today work regardless of platform. So going to dive into all of that good stuff. We talked about templates last week. We're now looking at emails and then looking ahead a little bit. Once we're setting up, hopefully over the next week, an email campaign, even if it's just a handful of emails, following up with people who are downloading a template, even just checking, hey, how's it going? Or leave a review before getting into at least sharing what our services are. Looking ahead, we're transitioning into some things that have worked well in the discovery process just over the past few years, how to get the most out of those discovery calls, and then I think most importantly, how to turn those into deals. So we're working our way through the process and focusing on email today. For probably the overwhelming majority of people who are creating templates, the relationship just stops there. And I think especially as consultants, these could play a pretty pivotal role where we're getting a touch point. It works differently than if we get a follow on LinkedIn or Instagram because they've opted into at least seeing how this template or resource works, and really breaks the ice a little bit if we do follow up with emails where I think the engagement is just generally higher than if we have somebody sign up on a basic generic form on our website or just find us on a platform. Quick check, mostly because I want to see where everybody's coming from today. I'd say email could get really complicated really quickly, and it could get really overwhelming. And I've been overwhelmed with this many times, even now, using Beehiiv and moving some automations over, thinking through what's the best platform. So I think the most important thing here is to start with as light of a lift as possible, just to get something up and running, to get that initial data. That just makes it a lot easier to build on top of, and also just get a sense of, does a platform work for you personally? Very brief overview of why this is valuable, especially for consultants and freelancers. We're getting data on who's downloading our stuff, and then I think later, what is the engagement looking in terms of opening emails? Are 90% of them unsubscribing after we reach out to them? Are they replying to emails? Things like that. So we're getting that data that just can inform the decisions we're making on future templates or following up with those contacts. So what we're looking at today, first, before we get into the automation, is just an email nurturing guide. If you're part of the consulting bootcamp, we're linking in our consultant canvas and our lead machine page if we started thinking through what are those templates that we're creating, just so that when we're drafting these emails, again, we want to make sure that we're having the AI block respond to as much context that we could give it as possible, just to get more personalized results. Nobody wants to get a super generic email campaign that looks like it was clearly created using AI tools. So the more we can personalize, the better. So we're going to get into how that looks. But generally, we want to guide the readers, the audience, towards some kind of action, at least the ones who would benefit from our services. So there's always going to be people who download templates and are doing research or trying to create something similar. Consulting services is not for them. It's not really a warm lead. But people who are looking at the template that you're making and it's actually solving a specific problem is a warm lead. Some things to keep in mind. We're getting data on how many people are finding the templates, downloading them. I think the Notion marketplace, when it first launched, was a little limited where you couldn't quite get data when it comes to emails or just specifics on views and engagement. I think it's gotten a lot better, and I think with webhooks, it's allowed to pull that data into other places. So we're going to get into that. And then lastly, we're just figuring out what group within that larger user base are good candidates for consulting. And one other note, I know we've talked about this in the past couple of weeks, but with the higher volume of content on different platforms, it's just getting more and more challenging to get engagement or to at least predict levels of engagement based on specific pieces of content. Whereas email, we know that at least for the people who are opening their emails, that's the only thing that they have open. And there's just the engagement level and the quality of engagement is higher in email versus just posting, even if we're posting a high volume of content. Yeah, I think it's just when it comes to warming up leads, plays a lot different role. And we want to change this relationship from I've downloaded this template from a random person or an anonymous account to I'm learning more about who made it, what you're doing, the services that you're providing, the wins that you've had for your clients. So again, we're informing with each additional email. All right, we are going to switch gears to the email nurturing guide. Not going to spend too much time on this. It's pretty straightforward, but I'm just going to drop the link in here so that we have it. And this we should be able to download or duplicate to our workspace. Works very similarly to the lead machine where we have sections for an email sequence and they're pre-populated with generally what might be useful to cover at that point in the sequence. So the welcome email, if we're setting this up after downloading a template, very succinct. We're just making sure that they got it and that it's working. So the more notes we add in here, the better, just again to personalize when we get into the AI block. So we have sections for each email. There's 7 in the sequence. You don't have to use 7 emails. It could be less, it could be more. This is just like from previous versions of testing this out over the past couple years. If we scroll down to the very bottom, we could see that when we get into email 6 and 7, we're getting into more specifics about what the type of services that we're providing, why they would benefit from it, and having clear call to actions, which is book a discovery call. Probably the discovery call is like the most effective at this stage to get them to take action. So if we take an example, the most important part of this guide is at the very bottom. When you go to generate, this requires Notion AI. So if you're using another AI tool, just copy and paste the prompts into Claude or ChatGPT and then see if you can export previous things that you've written, or for people in the bootcamp, if you've created the consultant canvas or a template, getting those as much information into that AI tool as possible. Mainly because this is the part where we're linking to other things that we've clarified, things like who our target audience is, what pain points are we solving. If we have a template, adding that here for reference so that Notion AI can review. Just for context, this example is using a resource for VC firms. So this is just like a dashboard to organize resources for their portfolio company founders. So whichever template we've made, if we've already made it, we want to make sure we link to that. And then just to confirm, the prompt goes into generally what each email is covering. But at the very bottom where we have using specified context, we want to make sure that those links are showing up here if we're using Notion AI, just so that we know that it's referencing that information. So when we click generate, what this is doing is taking the outlines from each of the callouts above and then drafting 1.0 versions of each email. We're not going to wait to go through the whole thing, but we can see here it's drafting a welcome email. We'll copy and paste these in when we do the Beehiiv portion. But we can see here it's referencing the Platform Hub template. We want to review just to make sure that it's accurate, and if there's any room for personalizing it or making it sound more like you, then the better. We'll leave that, we'll table that there, but we're going to use these to set up our automation. So we have our emails drafted, a series of 7 emails in that campaign. The next thing we want to do is anytime someone downloads a template from Notion Marketplace, save that into a Notion database, and then use that data to then add them to a Beehiiv automation. So it's going from they've downloaded a template, we're logging that download in a Notion database, and we have a quick template that I'll share also. And then lastly, that email gets added to an automation which runs on its own sends an email immediately, then one 2 days after, and then several days after. So that's what we're going to look at next. So we did that. This is the general timeline. Again, this is all editable if we want it to move faster. Generally find that if it's every day, it's a little overwhelming, maybe just personal preference. But next thing, we're going to switch gears to Relay. So a couple notes on Relay. This is probably the only automation tool that clients have felt comfortable going from 0 to 1 in automations and getting to the point where they feel confident enough to manage it on their own. So something to keep in mind, if you're just starting out with automations, they add a lot of connections to tools pretty often. And the CEO is in total sprint mode at all times, which is nice. So would definitely recommend it. What we want to do is set up an automation that is using a webhook. It probably sounds more complicated than it is. So we're going to walk through how this works. All right. So in Relay, and I'm just from our homepage, we're just going to create a new workflow. So if I click this blue button and then we're opening this, the trigger that we want to set up is a webhook. If we select this one, it's going to be a post webhook. And what this is going to do is give us a URL. This is what we're going to copy into our Notion marketplace. So if I were to copy this link, we're then getting specific formatted information from Notion marketplace to then put into our Notion database. So if we switch gears to Notion's marketplace website, if you have a Notion account, you could essentially be a template creator. So if you were to go to Notion's marketplace, which is notion.com/templates, and then log in, that's going to take us to this profile. And it looks a little bit different between Notion creators and consultants, but the part that we're looking at now is pretty much, it should be the same. So in the profile section, this just has information about you, but we have a webhook URL, which is the thing that we're going to be pasting in from Relay. So we paste it in here, we test it, and then when we click test, it's going to send information to Relay. So because technically what we want to do is we'd have to download a template to make sure that it's running effectively. We're going to pause here, and I've got a version which is the exact same thing, but continuing on into the different steps. So we have our webhook. That means that anytime someone downloads a template, it's sending that information to Relay. The next thing we want to do is bring that into Notion. If you're using Relay for the first time, there's a section called apps, which is basically where you connect any tools that you're using or that you're going to be using for the automation. Once you have those connected, they'll show up as options. But when we type Notion, we're going to create a page in a database, and I'm going to look for template downloads. While that's doing that, we're going to create our third step, which is using Beehiiv. So we have our Beehiiv step, and then what we're going to do is create a subscription. So that's going to be step 3. Let's go back here. Let's see if we found there we go, template downloads. All right, so we're adding it to this database. The fields that we want to populate, here we're going to add a few things. So the dates that it's run, I'm just going to say current date and time. Very important one that we need is email. So customer email. And let's say if we're selling templates, we can also bring in the price. We're getting that information into Notion and then clicking done. We could test this step to see if it runs, but we'll skip that part. Okay, in Beehiiv, we're going to look at setting up that automation next, but quickly, if you set up a newsletter, it should show up there. And then the one thing that we need from Notion is the email. So secondly, the only other thing that we need to populate is in Beehiiv. If we have an automation set up, we want to select that one, which is basically going to trigger them getting emails if it's active. So we're going to take a look at how that works. Just for context, when it's completed, this is one that's turned on for me personally. So we could see it's creating a page and template downloads. I'm also just grabbing the template name, the slug, which is the URL, their email, this other data on pricing. And even though most of the templates I have are free, I'm just grabbing it in the scenario that I go back to creating paid templates at some point, not having to go back in and set it up from scratch or make edits. And then one other step that we didn't do in the demo is just sending a message to a Slack channel called template downloads, just to see what is the volume of downloads, just like a quick notification. And then when it comes to creating a subscription, this is looking the exact same way as what we looked at. The way that we'd want to test this out is to basically go back into Notion Marketplace. And if you search for any one of your templates, when you find a template that is yours from your profile, this is just for context because we didn't look at this. This is when we add a template, it automatically grabs screenshots. So it's super easy to add a template to the marketplace. We're giving it some tags. You can change the slug, so the name of the URL. And then most importantly, at the very bottom, we're requiring email. So don't have to, but I think it's a fair trade-off that somebody's getting a free resource and then they're giving you their email. And then when you submit for review, it's usually like a couple days and then you get a response. So yeah, to finally test to make sure that it's bringing it into Notion, you'd want to make sure that you download a template, it adds it to your workspace, and then it triggers the automations. Okay, so we have our automation set up and it's sending any new email to that automation. But now we technically have a step that is prior to that, which is setting up our email automation in terms of what those emails look like, when they go out, how we're tagging those readers to make sure that we create organized buckets in our newsletter platform that we can then retarget later on if we have an announcement, or if you do a Black Friday thing, or it's the start of the year and you want to send out a broadcast to several different groups. Tags makes it a lot easier to do that. What we just did, to recap, we're using webhooks to set up that automation. We're saving to a Notion database. These are the main pieces of information that we want to grab. And then lastly, we're going to send those to Beehiiv. Okay. And next up, and I know some of us are using Beehiiv, which is pretty cool. One of the things that is really nice about Beehiiv is it's really easy to use and it's actually pretty powerful, like in terms of if you wanted to create a landing page or get deep into the weeds on segmenting different groups of people within your newsletter. And it's just straightforward to navigate and to work your way around. So this is a test account just to set up this automation completely from scratch. So when we're on Beehiiv, we have our audience information here so we can see our subscribers. If you're importing a list from another tool, you can do that there. But the area that we're going to focus on today is in automations. So if we click into automations, we're going to set one up completely from scratch. There's some templates here. None really apply for what we're doing, and it requires more editing than it's worth. So we're just going to create a blank automation. So I'm going to go back to the automations home, create automation, and new automation. We're going to call this VC template download sequence. Then I'm going to say anyone who downloaded Platform Hub. Cool. So we have that saved. Now we get Canvas where we're adding specific rules. There's a lot of different ways that this could go, but the three key things that we want to do here are, number one, make sure that we set up the trigger to be from the API, which is running in Relay as that last step of that automation, is sending it here. We're going to set that up in terms of when this automation is starting, and then setting up the rules to when and under what conditions are people getting this sequence of emails. So if we go to add trigger, we're going to click add trigger here, and we're going to say at the very bottom, add by API. As an aside, if you're using a standard email sign-up form, that would be this first one. So you would say if you have multiple forms, you select which one. But in this case, we're using add by API, and we're going to click save. So we don't need that data because we're just selecting it in Relay as long as it's part of your newsletter. We're going to keep that inactive for now until we set up at least the first 2 emails. So the next step is going to be, before we actually send an email, we're going to update subscription. So here, I'm going to open this settings, and we're going to tag this subscriber just so that we know where they came from. And as the list goes on, and as we maybe create a larger library of templates, tagging is going to be a helpful way to segment them a little bit more. So I'm just going to tag them as VC, and we're going to keep them subscribed as active. So we're just setting that rule and then click save. So we have our first 2 steps. Okay, next we're going to send our first email. So I'm going to click send email. And what this is going to do is, if we configure this step, we're going to create a new email. I'm just going to start with a blank draft, but we have some templates here. When we have this draft, let's open this full screen so that we can edit this. The first thing that we're going to edit is the subject line and preview text. So I'm just going to go back into, in a separate view, that email nurturing guide. So I'm going to copy and paste some stuff in. So I'm just going to open this up, and I'm going to drop this into the subject line and a little preview. Cool. So from here, this is our details. And then if we click into write, this is where we can start plugging in our actual email content. So I'm just going to replace this. I'm going to add this email draft. Just edit this a little bit. Would probably make sense to have like our links at the bottom of the draft. So we have our email, we have our details. Then I'm going to click save. And if I go back, we could see here, I could get a preview of this email, and then I'm going to hold off on activating that until the very end. One more step I'm going to go through is, for the next email, we want to wait a little bit. So we don't want to send it immediately after, and we want to decide how long that is. So in this case, if you're running a timed campaign, if everybody's getting the same emails at the same time, you can say wait until a specific date. But in this case, we're sending these out dynamically, which means that instead of specifying a date, we're just going to say, give it a time delay of, we'll say 2 days. So the user gets an email, and then 2 days passes, and then they get this next email. So we're going to send another email here. We're going to open this up, create new email, blank drafts, open this full screen so we can edit it. I'm going to add the subject line, additional text here, and then in the body, I'm going to drop in some from the nurturing guide. So this is, in this case, we're checking in, how's the template going, and then a few additional tips on, hey, just FYI, you could do this and this in the template. Depending on if you're creating like an ebook type of resource or a checklist, this might look very differently. But for the case of a template, this probably is a good, I'd say, low intensity interaction before you start selling. Okay, so if we click save, the goal here is to continue on these steps and then to activate it at the very end. So once you have your first batch of emails in place, if you go to configure and you activate these steps, you'll see that it gets illuminated, in this case blue. The time delay, we're going to turn that on here. Let's turn on these 2 steps, and then that should be good to go. The last thing we'd want to do, which we could probably do independently, let me just make sure that this first one is activated. As long as it's illuminated, it's live. And then if we go into settings, this is what we set up initially. Re-entry, this is just in the case that somebody unsubscribes, but then they download another template a few months into the future. Can they go through the same process again? Probably keep that off for now, but there's scenarios where you can turn that on. And then in overview, this is where you're going to get your data. So another really nice thing about Beehiiv is it takes the most useful data and highlights it, and you can always get into the weeds, but you get a general overview of what's the open rate, what's the engagement looking like for emails, which could be really hard to find, especially if you have these running at different times. Being able to go into the overview page and seeing how many steps there are, how many subscribers, unsubscribes, just gives you a high level overview of how these campaigns are doing. So from there, the last thing that we'd want to do before we completely get up and running is essentially go through the same steps of downloading a template, make sure that it's getting added to the template downloads database, and then it's triggering sending an email in that sequence. So you want to at least make sure that first automated email is going out to you, or if you have an alias email, just to make sure that it looks as expected and there's no kind of surprises there. And then the one other thing that I'll drop in the chat so that we have that is the template downloads template. This is a pretty straightforward database. Just drop the link for this. But if you open the database, it gives you name, template, slug, audience, email, all of the pricing information, and the date. This is pretty much all the info that you need, or more than what you need for the relay automation. But that way you're getting into Notion, and then it's just a lot easier down the line if you want to group by template or group by date, just seeing how many downloads are there by each of those categories. It makes it a lot easier to do that. So from there, a couple things that we want to look at as we get our email sequence up and running. And for those of us in the bootcamp, I'm going to be sharing more of a deep dive on going from 0 to 1 in a tool like Beehiiv. What we want to look for is open rates. This could shift quite a bit even from the subject line. So Beehiiv has an option for A/B testing, which is basically testing out different subject lines for the same email. A lot of that is very much trial and error and getting a sense of what gets more engagement, social media content. And then in the email guide, as we get into the later emails, we want to make sure that we have opportunities for readers to reply. Maybe they have a question, maybe they just have some feedback or some notes. The more replies that we get, we definitely want to have the opportunity for them to reply and just make it clear that you can reply to that email. And what we'll probably notice, or at least what I've noticed, is the readers who reply is often a small percentage, but they're very engaged. So in a lot of cases, leads that turn into projects, they had downloaded a template or they found my YouTube channel or kind of had these other indirect touch points before having that discovery call, which definitely makes it a lot easier to pitch and to see if it's a good fit to work together. And then as we get later into the campaign, getting a sense of how many can we convert to booking a discovery call. That's going to be a small number. It could be 5 or 10%, which is why the volume is such a key component. And it takes some time to get up and running, but the benefits continue to pay off as people continue to find your templates and resources and find out about what you're doing long after you've set these workflows up. And then just going back to the email can get super overwhelming. Couple like basic milestones to avoid the potential for overwhelm. If we're looking at the next month or pretty much through the end of the year, if we set up our first batch of emails, setting it up once and then just letting it go where we're just looking at the data, not really tweaking it too much, we could end up in an endless loop of tweaking and refining, where the downside is we're not getting useful data because we're making constant changes. And then as we go further in the process, doing controlled experiments like changing subject lines, like A/B testing, where we have the same email, but the subject line is different, and potentially continuing to add on to that sequence. So we might wrap up a project that makes sense as a case study that then you send in a follow-up email talking about, hey, we had this great success with this client. Here's how working together benefited their team. So you always have the option to continue building off of that initial sequence. And then some things to watch for that could be signs that we might need to rethink either the templates or resources that we're creating or the content of the email. If we notice that there is a heavy amount of unsubscribes, obviously we're going to get some regardless of the content, even if it's amazing. People are just not interested. That's fine. But if we have a heavy amount of unsubscribes, that could mean that either it wasn't quite clear why they're getting the email, maybe it's not tied enough to the content of the template, or the content of the email is not actionable enough. Maybe it's jumping straight into selling before we build that relationship. So this could be from a number of reasons, but we want to watch out for those. And then if we have a high volume of people downloading but zero replies or zero engagement, looking at how do we make that call to action a little bit clearer? How do we incentivize people to respond? When I first set up these campaigns, I'll offer Notion sessions for the first 5 people who reply. Sometimes it's just one person, but I don't have to communicate that. But there's ways to increase engagement. And again, it's just a way to see who's interested and who's willing to invest their time in meeting together. And to highlight that point a little bit more, when we get replies to emails or when we get people taking us up on an offer to jump on a call, they're definitely warmer and further along in the process, which increases the likelihood dramatically that the right people in that target audience will turn into paying clients. Now, obviously, there's some variables later in that process. Do you align on timing? Do you have the bandwidth? Do you align on pricing? So there's those things that we're getting into in the bootcamp. But this is that necessary foundation to get to that point to open the door to turning leads into clients. And then lastly, before we get into some questions or some notes, the nurturing guide, again, that's trying to simplify setting up those 1.0 versions of those emails and saving some time there where you could just have it generate those drafts. Again, the more context you give it, the better. If you have Notion pages or databases where you've stored things that you've written, that's really helpful for these AI blocks to personalize what it's drafting for anything written. If you're just starting out with automation or email, trying to compartmentalize that a bit because it could get overwhelming. We have our normal day-to-day work that we have to focus on in addition to these projects. Starting with that first level relay automation, and then when it comes to Beehiiv, getting acquainted with setting up that automation initially just to test it, make sure that it's working. Hopefully that kind of walkthrough, and I'll add the video recording for everybody who's here, but trying to focus in on that because when we're just thrown into a new tool, it could be pretty overwhelming. Get a handle on what features are useful to use and how do we go from 0 to 1. And just a heads up, the same time next week, we're shifting gears to talking about discovery. So this is really all about the pre, during, and post tips based on what's worked the best over the past few years when it comes to using that initial conversation to get buy-in, to make sure that you're talking to the right decision maker in an organization, and how to get that potential client to go from knowing very little or nothing about what you do to being bought into your methodology, to the service, which can be a big jump. And I think that was definitely a challenge going from this project-based proposals to like audit followed by month-to-month engagements and increasing pricing. A lot of the getting buy-in kind of had to change in terms of how I was approaching it, where it's just more cultivating that lead and more back and forth, longer timelines to get approval on higher budgets. So going into the nitty-gritty on that and some things that have worked well in that process. I'll also share that out to everybody here, but otherwise, that's all I got. So have a great rest of your Thursdays.